we on this show, Ben Timberley and I have received legal threats from the Labour Party saying we can't talk about this or that, and if we do, it's breaking this law and that law and that law. I think there's not many people who've had as many legal threats or experience with lawyers as you have. Is this a particularly bad time in history for legal threats and stopping free speech?
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing, Crispin, is, when a political system becomes unsustainable, then it responds by greater authoritarianism, by trying to close down and silence those who are threatening it. And that's exactly what we're seeing in this country at the moment. We have a country that's falling apart. I mean, no two ways about it. And I say this as an outsider. I've only lived here for 21 odd years. But the reality is, this government is, every time the prime minister or senior cabinet minister opens their mouths, we know they're lying. So they're mendacious. They're completely incompetent. They're corrupt, and they're authoritarian, as we're seeing through the police bill, as we're seeing in what very sadly looks like it'll be the extradition of Julian Assange to spend the rest of his life in an American jail. Here is someone who exposed the worst possible war crimes, and he's been in jail ever since, and the perpetrators of the war crimes are heroes and being knighted and et cetera, et cetera. So I think every time you have a political system that is falling apart, the response of those in power, of those who benefit from the system, is to try and silence those who oppose it. But in our situation, it's not just about the government. If we look at the opposition at the moment, it's a sort of a version of the Tories, a sort of a light version of the Tories, where we have this completely uncharismatic leader who violated all 10 of the pledges he made in his leadership election. Yeah. And, if someone actually came on and listened to the guy speaking, they'd think, oh, there's another Tory. And so, in an attempt to close down the sort of space that was opened up by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party and the sort of mass popularity of that anti-establishment leadership, the Labour Party has again just become a tool of the same establishment. And it's the same, to use the late David Graeber's phrase, it's the same 1% who benefit. And they benefit materially, financially, personally, they benefit politically. And we shouldn't forget that. And so the response to that is always to try and close down dissenting voices, because that's what they need to do to keep the system intact as it is.
Now, I wanted to, I'd like to draw a parallel with South Africa, because you were obviously active in the anti-apartheid movement and also became an ANC MP. So how would you see the way they would have clamped down in South Africa, obviously, to stop dissent? How would you see the parallel with that? And how can we kind of imitate the success of what happened in South Africa with the movement there?
Well, I think there are two things. I think the first thing is that obviously the way in which dissent was crushed in South Africa was more brutal and even more authoritarian than we see in so-called Western democracies today. But, we didn't have a free press. You'd pick up a newspaper and most of it would be blacked out by the censors. So you literally were being stopped from reading. When I was 12 in 1976, when we first got television in South Africa, we had 1 hour of television a night, and it was some terrible American Western series, and half an hour of sort of state-sanctioned news, which was about the glories of the apartheid state. So we haven't got quite to that level yet, but we are seeing the beginnings of this sort of drift to authoritarianism and, may I say it, to fascism. And we're seeing it in many Western democracies today, and it is terrifying. So, and the irony, Crispin, is that even in the democratic South Africa, which is, of course, in every conceivable way so much better than the racist oligarchy that came before it, when there have been challenges to the democratic order, from the presidency of Thabo Mbeki, Nelson Mandela's successor, onwards, there has been a similar clamping down. I mean, I in Parliament tried to investigate a huge $10 billion arms deal in which at least $350 million of bribes were paid. And the president tried to persuade me to stop my committee's investigation. And when I refused and continued to investigate, he eventually went on state television and effectively said I was an enemy of the state. But all that did, this remains, the arms deal and its corruption remains a very live issue in South African politics 20-something years later, with former President Jacob Zuma on trial with a French arms company. So, they can try and suppress these sorts of things, but the reality is that becomes unsustainable over time. And that's the great lesson of the struggle against apartheid. It was a long struggle. I mean, we're talking about almost 50 years before apartheid was ended. But what characterized that struggle was extraordinarily broad solidarity in the liberation movement. So people put aside what were differences that were less important than the overarching objective of getting rid of the racist system of apartheid. And I think we can learn from that. But then there was also solidarity between people in South Africa, led by the vast majority of South Africans who made the country ungovernable, and this extraordinary global network of support in the global anti-apartheid movement. And even then, our governments, including the Thatcher government, the Reagan government, who described Mandela as a terrorist, they were supporting apartheid. They were supporting it economically, financially, they were providing it with diplomatic cover. But the power and the unrelenting persistence of the global anti-apartheid movement meant that the system, even with all of its Western support, had to crumble at some point. And I think that's the lesson that we on the left have to take as we look at current struggles, as we look at struggles around the massive inequalities in our societies and across the world, the massive injustices where we see what's going on in Yemen, in Palestine, and the reality of this tiny little oligarchy that is benefiting materially from all of this, is we have to put aside some of our lesser differences. We have to unify around the bigger picture, and we have to ensure that we are a global movement that speaks to each other. So each of us has to do our political work in our own localities and countries, but we also have to be conscious of and work with colleagues and comrades from the broader global struggles that are basically about the same issues. Something like climate change, which I believe is at least partly, it's been intensified, worsened, and denied primarily by neoliberal capitalism, which is at the root of so many of the issues we're discussing today. And the reality is that the climate catastrophe is not something that we can deal with in a particular region of the UK, or in the UK as a whole, or in Europe as a whole. This is something that we have to address globally, and we have to work together in solidarity to address all of these issues in the same sort of way. I think those are the lessons from the struggle against apartheid.
Well, I mean, it's quite easy to get dispirited about the situation, and lots of people are kind of struggling because there's no Labour Party they can join. There's no alternative party. Do you think there's an answer to that, or is it something that will just emerge?
Well, no, I think there definitely is. I've been asked, I resigned from Parliament in protest at my own party's refusal to allow my committee to investigate that big corrupt deal in, late 2001, so over 20 years ago. And people say to me, do you miss politics? And I say to them, well, how can I miss politics when I'm more politically engaged today than I was as a member of Parliament? That parliamentary politics does have enormous power because they have legislative power, of course, over the country, which is an immense form of power. But in terms of political engagement, I think there is so much space, so much creativity to engage politically outside of those narrow formal structures. And I think that's what's so great about programs like your own, about social media, which of course also has huge problems, but it is making it easier for progressive forces to communicate on a global level. But I think underpinning that is something that I just want to mention very quickly. You know, the big problem with the internet, with social media, is that sometimes it's difficult to ascertain the quality of the information that is being distributed on some of these platforms. And I think the most important thing that we can all do is develop our critical faculties to be able to look at a piece of information, look at the sources of that piece of information, and determine whether it is verifiable and whether it is a truthful piece of information or not. You know, in my last book, The Shadow World, on the global arms trade, the most secretive and corrupt of all trades, the book contained almost 3,000 footnotes, because everything we wrote about, everything we say publicly, everything we put in the film, The Shadow World, was verified by either documentary evidence or significant multiple human sourcing. And I think we, on the left, broadly speaking, need to make sure that that is the way we operate, that we actually take issues of truth and lies very seriously, and that we determine the sources of certain information that are put in front of us and decide whether that information is actually verifiably true or whether it is simply being used to perpetuate a particular political viewpoint, position, or ideology. That is one of the greatest challenges we face.
But that's really good. Can you tell us a bit about Declassified UK, which you're a board member of? Is that right?
Absolutely. So this is one of the incredibly exciting things, again, about the way in which the media landscape is changing. Our traditional mainstream media really only serves the interests of their owners, who are a serious tiny group of oligarchs around the world, incredibly wealthy people, institutions, and they've become part of the establishment. Sadly, that's even the case with some of those publications that were seen as sort of left of center, like The Guardian. So I think we have to accept that the traditional media has had its day, but in its place, there is this incredible fountain of new, very good, hard-nosed sources of journalism. So Declassified UK, and I'd encourage you all to look at it on the web, look at it on social media, is a group of former journalists who, some of whom were in the mainstream media, and some of the best up-and-coming young investigative journalists in the country. And they focus on British foreign policy, on the British arms trade, on British militarism, British intelligence operations, and they really bring to public knowledge the reality of Britain's role in the world. And it is eye-opening and shocking. And there are many others in addition to Declassified, appealing to a wide range of audiences. And Novara Media is another one that comes to mind, and various others. And there's some great people working on these platforms, and we need to give them our support. And again, I think the way to figure out whether these platforms are good or not, whether they can inform our ongoing struggles or not, is to look at the information and be critical of it. Ask yourself, are these verified pieces of information that are being presented here? And that's why I feel so comfortable serving on the board of an entity such as Declassified UK. I serve on the board of another entity based in Holland called Lighthouse Reports, that's puts together journalism from around the world on refugees and on the arms trade and other things. And these are impeccably sourced, really well investigated journalism, things that the traditional mainstream media no longer does. We just don't see meaningful investigations into our governments by the traditional media. Look at us in the situation in the United Kingdom. We have a prime minister who quite literally cannot tell truth from lies, or if he can, he's then a sociopath, which is also possible. The reality is there are a string of scandals from the time he was mayor of London. He was fired from various jobs before he became a politician, basically for lying. When he was mayor of London, there are a string of corruption scandals involving one of his myriad mistresses who was paid a huge amount of public money by the authority of which he was in charge, never been properly investigated. Becomes prime minister, which in itself shows the extraordinary failure of our media, that a person like this could even become prime minister of this country. But then when he's prime minister, let's take just one example, almost 40 billion pounds of public money given to a friend of his, who no one will be shocked to discover is a Tory party donor, to create a track and trace app to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, an app that has never worked. Now, how is it that there is not a major investigation, that there are not a series of legal cases involving the prime minister, the responsible minister, and the executives that received these extreme amounts of public money for producing something that never worked and that failed? How can we claim to be a functioning democracy when this is the person who today remains our prime minister, when this company continues to function, having taken almost 40 billion pounds of our money? Because as Nelson Mandela told us immediately we came to power in South Africa, he said to us, your salaries are paid by the people you serve. This is what he said to us as MPs. And never forget that, because the moment at which you think you are more important than the people who've elected you, the people who pay your salaries, the people who fund this government, is the moment you are of no value to this movement, to this country, and to the people of this country. And so many countries like ours in the UK, but many, many others around the world, are in the same position, where this notion of being a public representative, of being a servant of the people, could not be further from the reality of what politicians are like today. And that's down to us as citizens. And I think here, I want to go back to the example of the anti-apartheid struggle. What brought down apartheid was millions of ordinary South Africans making the country ungovernable, and the tens of millions of people who supported them from around the world. And that's what we need again in the world in which we face, because the world is corrupt in the very broadest sense of that word. And hundreds of millions of people are suffering as a consequence of that.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic to hear you speak again, and good to see you. Thank you for coming on the show. We've got Ben Timberley, who's our kind of investigative reporter here. Ben, do you want to say hello to Andrew?
Hello, Andrew. Good to see you, mate.
Hiya, Ben, and great strength to you and your fingers and the work that you do. It used to be that we would say great strength to your arm because you wrote with your arm, but of course, who actually writes nowadays? So it's our fingers, I suppose.
Absolutely. From you,
strength to you, and the recent nonsense going on, the letters you've received, solidarity on those. We've all been in that position. To think that the Labour Party has the money to start running prosecutions of individual members is laughable. Keir Starmer, who happens to be my own constituency MP, has taken the party from a surplus of, I think, around 13 million pounds into a massive deficit, which doesn't say much for the way he'd run the finances of the country were he ever to become prime minister. But it says a lot about his leadership of the party. So, you know, even to think that the party still seems to be spending money on trying to drive out its own members, people in the alternative media, is just absolutely farcical. And I have to just say here, you know, as a Jewish member of the Labour Party, the sort of targeting of progressive Jewish members of the party, investigating them, suspending them, and expelling them, supposedly in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, has to be one of the greatest oxymorons in modern political history in Britain. It really does. I'm really sorry, Crispin and Ben, that I've got to go off. I have another engagement starting in a few minutes, but it's great to be with you, and just all strength to you and the work that you do, and everybody who listens to you. Never forget, we have a responsibility as active citizens. As Margaret Mead, the American anthropologist, once said, history is changed by the actions of small groups of committed, thoughtful citizens coming together. Always has been the case, always will be.